Living a life in full is a conversation you always wanted to have with that person who gave an amazing TED Talk, or the author of one of your favorite books, or that inspirational Olympian you always wanted to know more about. It's graduate-level conversations with those making a difference in the world and in the lives of others. This show brings you new ideas and approaches so that you can live a life in full. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Stout, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to another episode of Living a Life in Full. I'm Dr. Chris Stout, your host, and today's episode is brought to you by the ATI Foundation. ATI Physical Therapy's philanthropic efforts extend their commitment to quality care outside clinic walls by giving back to communities. They touch the lives of thousands of people each year through their ATI Foundation. The ATI Foundation is an independent 501c3 charitable organization that gives help and hope to children with physical impairments. Since 2003, the foundation has raised over $4 million to assist children with physical impairments in our communities. Often, the beneficiary families have mounting debt and are overcome by financial and physical obstacles. Through the work of the clinical and corporate team members, they raise funds to purchase medical equipment, pay medical bills, remodel families' homes to accommodate their child's special needs. But more importantly, they give families hope by offering a better quality of life for their child. To learn more about the foundation and ATI, please visit atipt.com. Welcome to another episode of Living a Life in Full. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Stout. I'm very excited today to have a good friend of mine, Rich Gengler, who is the founding CEO at Prevail Health, but also quite an accomplished fellow in a variety of other ways. Rich grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and graduated with honors from the University of Minnesota Carlson School of Management with a degree in accounting. After that, he joined the U.S. Navy flight program and was designated a Naval Aviator and selected to fly the FA-18 Hornet, where he served for 9.5 years. During that time, Rich participated extensively in various assignments in support of the global war on terror. He was Operational Test Director at Air Test and Evaluation Squadron 9, VX-9, which sounds really cool, and was responsible for the testing and evaluation of weapons. He served 2 tours aboard the aircraft carrier, the USS Constellation. He flew numerous combat missions as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom and earned an Air Medal for his distinguished service. Rich is also a graduate of Booth Graduate School of Business at the University of Chicago. He's worked as an associate at Dunrath Capital, Incorporated, a private equity and venture capital firm. And as I'd mentioned, he's currently the founder and CEO of Prevail Health, a healthcare technology company that addresses specifically mental health issues in the veterans and military space and with health promotion needs with the U.S. Department of Defense and U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. Welcome to the show, Rich.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. So, historically, you and I think, first crossed paths at in Stanford, right? At Stanford Medicine X. So you were on a panel talking about Prevail Health back then.
Yep.
So, gosh, when was that? 2005? When was that? I can't.
I think it might have been 3 years ago, it seems like.
All right. I have totally lost track of time. So that was just really a neat experience and just great opportunity to start to get to know you and your work. So, a variety of things, my agenda. I want to talk about what it's like to be a successful founder. And in this episode, we'll probably spend a lot of time talking about startups and being an entrepreneur and things like that. But before we get into that, I want to kind of deconstruct what you've learned. And so our listeners that are interested in technology and startups and entrepreneurship can kind of, get that. We've had folks that have been on that are very technology-oriented and healthcare-oriented, but I think you'll be unique in this space so far as our guest. So I'm excited about our show. I gave a little background sketch in terms of your upbringing, but kind of give us a little more granularity about your origin story. How does someone transition from being an accounting major to a fighter pilot?
Right. Well, I guess the first thing I'll say is my transition was not kind of the normal transition. It's pretty competitive to be a fighter pilot, and most people that do that have a background having wanted to do that. So, most of the people that get into the program have, started thinking about that when they were teenagers, and they did a lot of things to prepare for that. And I was kind of not on that path. I sort of fell into it at the end. I went to school in Minnesota, like you said, to get an accounting degree without any thought of the military. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, Madison's pretty landlocked, as you know, so there's not a lot of people going into the Navy.
Yeah.
And had never thought of that as an option. And my last year in college, I went to an interview with someone else in my school, and he and I went out to lunch afterwards. And at lunch, he said, "Hey, in addition to this, I'm thinking about getting into the flight program in the Navy." And I remember thinking, that's a crazy thing to do. Why would you want to do that? And he kind of gave me the details on it. And so as I thought more about that, I just thought, hey, that sounds like a pretty neat thing to do, and kind of got interested from there. In order to do that, you go through a pretty rigorous application process. So if you want to get into the flight program, you apply directly for that.
Did you have flying experience? Were you already a pilot, or?
No, I had zero flying experience. That's actually pretty normal too. The
be
Navy's training's pretty unique, and they sort of pride themselves on taking people from zero flight time to putting them through that process.
Wow.
And they actually so when you get in, you get into flight school, and it's very competitive, and you go and you have flights, and they're graded, and then where you eventually make it to depends on your grades. It's a very competitive environment. And so everyone who gets there comes with plans about how they're going to succeed in that environment. And one of the sort of words on the street when I got there was that if you had prior flight time, that would actually be harder for you, because in your early flights, your instructors would assume that you can do things because you have prior flight time. So most people would not get a lot of prior flight time just so they didn't have to come and say, I have prior flight time.
Wow.
And then some people that did have prior flight time would not fess up to that. Of course,
Sure.
If you get caught doing that, that's not good. So
Yeah.
that was fairly frequent, but the program's really designed to train people without any flight experience. So I'd literally never been in a cockpit before I went to the Navy and was in a cockpit.
What was that like?
The first time, it's pretty daunting. The hard part about flying is that you're doing a lot of things at once and quickly. So you don't have a lot of time, and you have a check, when you just starting up an airplane is a checklist of 15 things, and you'd like to take a half an hour doing that, but you have 3 minutes to do it. And so you're kind of overwhelmed for most of the beginning of flight school. You're just trying to stay caught up and get the things done. So it's a pretty intense experience if you haven't done it before.
Yeah. So do you start off like in a trainer? Do you start off in a Cessna 152? What's the first thing with wings that you set foot in?
Yeah, you start out, you start with ground school. So you do, I think it was about 3 or 4 months of just ground school instruction. And then the first airplane that you get into it's a propeller plane, but it's a turboprop. So it has a turbine engine that drives a propeller.
Okay.
So it's as compared to a Cessna 172, it's much faster. It's a much more complex airplane. But you in the early days, you do, for every hour of flight time, you'll do 20 hours of studying. So each flight will have a set, syllabus of things that you're going to do. And before you show up for the flight, you'll study and prepare for hours and hours. You'll sit in the kitchen. They call it chair flying. You'll go through the flight in your head and all the things that you're going to do in preparation for it. Because, every flight, there's an instructor sitting in the back, and you're being graded on that. Mm-hmm. And at the end of, each stage, they'll take everyone that completes at that stage, and then they'll rank you by your, what grades you got, and then they'll decide where you're going to progress from there. So
like you start off with X number of applicants, so to speak, and then it just gets fewer and fewer and fewer? Yeah,
sort of that. So a certain percentage of the people that start won't be able to finish. They call it washout of the program. Mm-hmm. But also what you end up flying in the military determines how you progress through flight school. Mm. So, there's different kinds of airplanes in the Navy. There's fighter airplanes, there's helicopters, there's fixed wing propeller airplanes. And, some airplanes are, more desirable from the candidates when they first start than others. And you get separated on those paths based on your grades. It's a combination of your grades and the needs of the Navy. Mm-hmm. Some weeks they need more of one type of airframe than another type of airframe. But, if you want to be competitive, you have to do really well in your classes. And, of course, it's a very competitive environment. So everyone who got there is, has been dreaming of being a pilot since they were 15 years old.
Right. Or an accountant.
Right, or an accountant. They did very well to get into the program, and then they're working very hard to be the top of their class. So it's a ultra competitive environment, and you need to do pretty well if you want to control where you wind up. So in that kind of environment, every flight is sort of like a final exam, and you prepare a lot for every single flight.
How often do you fly in that training period?
You probably fly 3 or 4 times a week.
Okay.
It kind of goes in fits and starts. So sometimes you'll fly less than that, and then sometimes you'll have a number of flights.
And are they like always like out someplace and back? Are they touch and goes or combination or what?
Early on, you don't do a lot of touch and goes. You're doing more out and back, but the flight will have a list of maneuvers and procedures that you're going to do. So you'll do a stall, and you'll do a circle to land, and you'll do pretend like your engine went out and you're going to emergency land, and you'll have just a list of the 10 things that you're going to do in the flight. Before the flight, you'll go have a brief. Well, you'll present to the instructor, here's all the things I'm going to do and how I'm going to do them. Then you'll go out and do that in the flight, and you'll come back and have a debrief. Well, you'll talk about all the things you did and how you did those, and then the instructor will give you a grade. And each stage will have, I think the first stage there was probably 15 to 20 flights total, and then at the end of that, you're done with that stage, and then they determine what stage you're going to next, and that stage could be to go down a pipeline for different airplanes.
So you meet a first criterion, and then you could be diverted away from fighter jets to turboprops or whatever. So
yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. Okay.
And
so,
that happens fairly quickly. So you go through a couple stages, and then they put you in a pipeline to be kind of a broad airplane type. And then once you're in that pipeline, which particular airplane you fly within that type depends on how you progress.
Are there certain things you learn that generalize to just about no matter what you're flying, so to speak? I mean, are there navigational things or other kinds of things that scale to other? I'm flying a fighter jet, or I'm flying a 172.
Yeah, I mean, the core principles of flying there's some foundational things that you want to do. One of them's saying they have in aviation is aviate, navigate, communicate, and what that means is if there is a problem and you're trying to troubleshoot that problem, there's, especially military airplanes, there's emergencies all the time. So fairly often something goes wrong, and then you're trying to figure out how to get back and land safely or deal with that problem. And it's really easy to get kind of overwhelmed by a problem and start talking or reading, thinking about what you have to do, and forget about the fact that you're flying an airplane and you need to keep doing that.
Wow.
So, when you have an emergency, the first thing you need to do is make sure the airplane keeps flying safe. The next thing you need to do is pay attention to where you're going, so you're navigating to the right place. And then the third thing you do is talk to people about it. And you have to really kind of stomp that into people to get used to doing that. And there's a bunch of just fundamental things that are foundational to flying that you learn early on, and you learn really well in the military.
I bet. Wow. So the excuse me, the other part of training I'm curious about, I have a friend that was he's a clinical psychologist, but he had done work early on, like at the Top Gun school or whatever, of the spin and barfs and things like that. So, I mean, from his perspective, he was looking at like human capacity kinds of training. Did you have that sort of thing too? The rocket sled or the centrifuge, or what non-winged kinds of training did you have as well?
Yeah, they do a bunch of that to both see if what kind of your limits are. So, air sickness, for instance, is a problem for a certain amount of the people. Those airplanes are not like flying around in a airliner. They're not nearly as comfortable, and it's very weird sensations.
I bet.
And so early on, almost everyone gets airsick a bit and feels queasy. Most people get over that, but some people can't. And so they put you through some simulations to see if you're prone to that or not. They also put you through simulations to handle G forces. So in those airplanes, you experience a lot of G forces. The airplane I flew pulls 7.5 Gs, and that's a pretty tough thing to do.
And stay awake.
Yeah,
right?
and stay awake.
You start
Well, and it's not comfortable also. It's just
Yeah.
it's a tough thing to do. And you build up a tolerance to that over time. So if you and I were sitting in the airplane and all of a sudden we experienced 7.5 Gs right now, we would probably pass out.
Yeah.
But if you experienced 3 Gs and got used to that, and then 4 and 5 and so on, then you build up a tolerance to do that. And so you do a lot of training outside of the airplane to build up your tolerance to G limits and things like that.
Wow. I didn't realize it was sort of I could see getting used to things, but I didn't know if it was like that you could actually build up tolerance for that. That's crazy.
Yeah. The problem is the quick version is when you pull Gs, the blood wants to go down in the direction of the Gs. And so it's tough to keep the blood up in your head, which can cause you to pass out. And so you basically have to clench all your muscles to keep the blood up in your head easier.
Yeah, I've heard that, like tensing your thighs and lower extremities and stuff, because it really likes to pool in your legs. It's a large body mass and things. And are there suits that help do that as well too?
There's two things. They have what they call a G suit. So it's a full body suit that has bladders in it that fill up with air. They're hooked in the airplane, and as you pull Gs, it fills up with air more, and it squeezes all your muscles to help that blood pooling. And then you do they call it the hook maneuver, but you basically tense up all your muscles. So you take a deep breath, hold your breath, and tense up all your muscles. And then when it's time to take another breath, you have to let it out, which your muscles release. And so really quickly you take another breath and you tense your muscles, and that helps hold the blood up in your head so that you less prone to pass out.
Gosh.
They also want you to understand what it feels like when you're going to pass out. And so they'll put you in those centrifugal machines so that you can get close to passing out, and you kind of feel what it feels like when that's impending.
Wow.
And then so when you're in the airplane, if you're pulling a lot of Gs and you're feeling like you're getting lightheaded and dizzy, you're going to pass out, you can, release the turn, and the Gs will, and G forces, as soon as you let go of the Gs, it comes right back. You're not going to pass out.
But there may be certain circumstances in combat, I would imagine, where you don't have that luxury, right? So you can't, oh my gosh, I'm feeling dizzy, I need to, do you use some of those other techniques and stuff in those situations, or how does that work?
Yeah, in real a couple things. One is most of the Gs that you pull are when you're doing air-to-air combat in dogfighting, and that rarely happens in the real world.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the times where people experience too many Gs in real situations is if they're, off course and they're turning hard to get back on course, or they need to leave quickly, and so they're turning hard to leave quickly.
I see.
But usually in those situations, things are moving quickly and they're happening fast, and so you really have to be trained well to recognize that, because the signs of a problem are very subtle when you're thinking of a lot of other things. And so if you're not well trained, you won't recognize that, which is why they go through all those lengths to train you well.
Are your biggest threats from the ground then, or?
Yeah, mostly. So there's a lot of surface to air, missiles, artillery, things like that. And so your threats are mostly from the ground, and you're trying to avoid getting hit by those.
Gotcha.
is the biggest threat.
Gosh. Wow.
That and just flying an airplane around the middle of the ocean, landing on aircraft carriers is dangerous just in and of itself.
Well, that's the other thing. How do you train for that? How does that start? What's your first day of that like?
It's the training process is really unique, and it's actually a great life lesson. You start out, as I said, in a fairly comparably simple airplane. So you're flying a propeller plane that only goes so fast. And then if you progress to a more advanced airplane, the next airplane's more advanced. And I remember the first time that I got in for a flight on that propeller airplane, and it took a bunch of things to start it up and taxi, get my taxi instructions and taxi over to the runway and get ready to run the engines up and check everything, and then get clear for takeoff and start my takeoff roll. And then, you get airborne, you have to put the landing gear up, and there's people talking to you, and you're turning to things. And I got about a few hundred feet off the ground, and I just got completely overwhelmed.
Oh, gosh.
And the instructor had to take over and take the stick. Otherwise, I would have flown right into the ground.
Wow.
And I remember coming back and thinking, this is just too much. I'm not built that way. I can't do that many things that quickly. I'm not made for this. And so, you just double down and work harder and study harder. and get a little better the next flight and a little better the next flight. And by the end of that stage, I was a master of that airplane. There was nothing that I couldn't do with that airplane.
Wow.
And then, I was fortunate enough to select what I wanted after that. And so the next airplane that I flew was a much more advanced airplane. It went, twice as fast and was twice as complicated. And in flying, kind of one of the sort of rules is the faster you go, the harder it is, because you got to do things quicker if you're moving faster.
Yeah.
And I remember the first flight in that next airplane where, I went to take off and was overwhelmed and took off, put the gear up, and now we're going twice as fast. And again, the instructor had to take over or I would have crashed into the ground. And I remember coming back from that flight thinking, okay, I know I thought this last time, but this is for real. This airplane is my limit. I can't,
serious now.
I can't do this one. And again, you just go through, you just get a little better every flight. By the end of that stage, I was a master of that airplane and there's nothing I couldn't do with it.
Wow.
And you literally go through that 4 or 5 times. Wow. And then by the end of that, you're flying advanced fighter planes off of aircraft carriers. And when you start there, you can do that well. You can fly the airplane and you can employ all of its systems and you can land on a carrier and do your procedures, but you're generally a wingman to someone else. So when you fly around in the military, you're rarely flying by yourself. You're usually part of 2 airplanes or part of 4 airplanes. Mm-hmm. And so when you're part of 2 airplanes, there's one airplane in the lead, and then there's the second airplane that's the wingman. And so when you first get into the fleet, they call it, you're the wingman, and you're just kind of hanging on to your lead. It's taking everything you can do to fly the airplane and land on the carrier. You really can't do much more than that. Same kind of feeling, like, hey, I can do this, but I can't do that stuff also. Mm-hmm. And then, pretty soon you get good at that, and then you're the lead of a 2-ship, and then pretty soon you're the lead of a 4-ship, and then, at the end of that whole process, you're leading 60 airplanes into areas.
Wow.
And it really kind of goes like that. And it sort of reminds me of training to run a marathon. People can't run 26.2 miles normally. You have to get there, and you get there by running 4 miles this weekend.
Right.
And then the next weekend you run 6 miles, mm-hmm. and so on and so forth. And if if the last weekend you ran 16 miles and the next weekend you're supposed to run 18 miles, you almost don't even have to map it. You could just go out and run until you feel like you can't take another step or you're going to die. Uh-huh. And then that's 16 miles and just run 2 miles past that.
Plus that, yeah.
And at the end of that, you've pushed yourself to being able to run 26.2 miles. And training in the military and getting to a spot where you can fly those airplanes and do those things is really just like that. It's a bunch of taking on an extra 2 miles each weekend for a while.
So when you have those experiences where you feel like your instructor has to take over, then do you decide to say, hey, I'm willing to come back and give it another go? Or do they I mean, obviously they have to agree with you with that, but do they coach you to say, come on, Rich, everybody that's how it works. Now you get back in the cockpit and give it another whir.
So the instructor taking over is a very common thing. So there's, that happens all the time. You're graded every flight, and you hope to do well and go to where you want to go. But on the flip side of that, you could do poorly, and a certain amount of the people wash out of the program because they're doing poorly, and the instructors deem that that's a danger to themselves or others. Mm-hmm. And everyone who starts, kind of like I said, most people, it's very competitive to get into. Most people have wanted to do that for a long time, and so everyone in the program is working desperately hard to not wash out of the program. Mm-hmm. And if you're not doing well, you'll have a series of not doing well, and then just discussions with instructors, and you'll sort of know that you're on that cusp of that and be trying to do better. But because the instructors took over, that was normal. That okay. It's a hard thing, and every flight there's 150 things that you have to do right on every flight like that, and you're gonna mess up some number of them. You're not gonna do a perfect flight, and so right. It just matters whether you're messing up the things you shouldn't be messing up, and whether you're learning and progressing, and as long as you're doing that, then you're not.
So back to flight carriers, then we can start to shift gears. But do you have like an adrenaline rush, or do you get so like kind of zenned out and calm that this is just I've done this 100 times and this is 101? It's not a big deal.
It's definitely not the second. It's sort of interesting in that. So the hard part about flying airplanes like that is there's a lot going on, and you have to do a lot of things at once. And especially if you're in a single. So the airplane I flew was a single seat. It was just the pilot in there, and so you're doing everything. And there's a lot of things to do, and the airplanes are moving quickly. And so a lot of flying is just being very busy. You're kind of so task saturated that you don't have time to look outside and really appreciate the fact that you're flying a pretty awesome machine.
Yeah.
Some of the times it is. Some of the times you're not task saturated and you're looking outside going, wow, I can't believe I'm
pretty cool.
doing this. This is pretty cool.
Yeah.
But at least 50 or 60% of the time, you're too busy to be having that thought and thinking about that. You're also pretty concentrated on whatever the mission is. So, in the mission, you'll have to, be somewhere at a certain time and do something. And there's a lot of things that you have to do to make that happen. And so you're very focused on getting to that outcome. And there's a lot of stress involved also. So it's a dangerous environment. And it's an unforgiving environment. And, I think from the time that I started until I finished, I had 8 friends that I was pretty close with that lost their lives doing that. So the danger's real, and you understand that. And so there's enough kind of nervousness about that. And so, it's a mixture of kind of adrenaline and just, nervousness and some thrills here and there. It's kind of all of that
but really
together.
being focused on the task at hand too, which I would imagine helps mitigate the adrenaline or channel it, I guess. So
right.
How do you like when you leave? Are you sort of like catapulted off the aircraft carrier? I know you've got engines going, but
yeah, so the process, everything about the carrier is pretty amazing. It's actually just a phenomenal thing going on.
I'm so fascinated by it.
And when you take off, so there's a catapult that's steam driven, and the front of the wheels of the airplane have a little thing that goes into a shuttle on the catapult, and then that whips you off the front. And in order to get over there, you have to get sequenced, and so it's very busy on the flight deck, and there's airplanes everywhere, and it's dangerous. And you've started up your airplane, and you're doing a bunch of things to get it ready, and all your checklists, and you're busy. You'd like to have 30 minutes, but you got 3. And they're moving you around also, and so they direct you over to the catapult, and you get over to the catapult, and you get locked in. And then they put the catapult in tension, they call it, which is kind of like a loaded, cocked gun at that point. And so when they do that, you go to full power. In case it was to fire, you're under full power, you get airborne. And then when you go to full power, you do they call the wipeout, where you move your stick around so that you test all the surfaces, and you're looking at all your systems and making sure everything checks out and looks good. And when they fire you, you're going to go from 0 to 170 in just over 2 seconds. So it's a ride. And so you check out all your, and then you're going to be 60 feet off the water in the middle of the ocean trying to fly. And so, you're getting ready for this pretty, exciting thing that's going to happen, and you're nervous and all that. And so you check out all your instruments, and when you feel like you're ready to go, you give a salute to someone on the flight deck. That person then looks around to other safety people that are looking at different parts of your airplane, gets a thumbs up from all of them, and then when they're satisfied everything is ready to go, they give a salute. Once they give a salute, you can be fired, but the person who actually presses the button to fire the catapult is sort of out of your view. And that person looks around and does their own series of checks, and then they press a button. And when they press the button, you go from 0 to 170 in 2 seconds. You lose your vision. It's a ride.
Wow.
And so it's a really interesting experience.
Is there a little bit of a pause that you don't exactly when that button?
You don't know when it's going to hit. So you're ready to go, and you salute, and then you kind of when you're ready to go, you don't hold the stick because it's so violent you would overcorrect. So you hold the top. You just hold the sides.
Wow.
To brace for shock. You salute it, and you're like, okay, here it comes. But it's going to happen anytime between 2 and 8 seconds. You don't know exactly when, and so you're like, here it comes, here it comes, here it comes, and then all of a sudden, boom.
Wow.
And it really is a wild ride. It pins you to the back of the seat. Your vision starts to gray out on you, and when you hit the end of the catapult, the acceleration stopping feels like you aren't. It feels like it threw you forward, like you crashed into a wall. And then you grab the stick and you're off flying.
Wow. Yeah, I never really stopped to think about that. There's probably like this weightless pause or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, that is just incredible. Well, I had I don't know if you've ever heard of this. I had, when you talked about your stall, there was a thing, I don't know that they still do it anymore. I can't imagine that the insurance would be affordable, but there's a thing called Air Combat. And lame brains like me that, choose to go do something like that. It was at Palwaukee Airport. And they have these Marsetti 180s, which I guess are some Italian fighter training plane, a single engine. And you're side by side with someone that knows what they're doing, thank goodness. And you're in a like just a flight suit and a helmet and mic'd and stuff and a parachute. And they kind of give you this really super basic thing. They've got airplanes on sticks and all this. And you and someone else are going to do like a goofy air combat thing. You're going to pretend you're Tom Cruise or something. So we had done that, and the first day it was. I'm just like flight enthusiast. Not expert, not even beginner, but just like I thought that would be a fun, cool thing to do. So the first day we did it, there was a really low ceiling, and we got to kind of fly around, and we got to do some things, and really it was almost kind of like a good training, because they just said, we can't do what you wanted to do. Come back when the next day or whenever the weather's going to clear. But it taught me some of the stuff you were talking about, like tightening your thighs, because you'd feel this like nausea. And usually I don't get airsick, but we're doing barrel rolls and loops and stuff, like you said, you don't do in a commercial airplane. And all of a sudden, you're like going, wow, I really feel nauseous. So like for me, it was like chewing gum, squeezing my thighs, and having a little fresh air and stuff like that. So the next time, a day or two later, come out, and the way they have it set up, you've got like your little firing button, and they've got little GoPro cameras, like I think on the tail wing, in your cockpit, and on one of the wing tips. So you get this video then of like the guy behind you, and you see the guy looking at you and all this. And if you have like a little remote control thing, that if you hit some spot on theirs, smoke comes out, so that they're hit or you're hit or whatever. So since we're in matched planes, we take off, we're flying around to wherever we were going, and I'm feeling all, cocksure of myself and everything. So he showed me like how to do this loop. So we went down to gain airspeed, and then pulled back on the stick, and we go up, you have like that little thing of weightlessness for a second, and you come back down, and it was like, oh, that was really cool. So I said, okay, now apply that to catching the other guy, because that's how you can get behind him, get up speed. So we do that. I'm all enthusiastic. And I pull back on the stick, and it goes up, and I had forgotten to dive first, so I didn't have enough airspeed.
Right.
So what happened? Like all of a sudden, I see my propeller just stop. And I thought, uh-oh, that's probably not a good thing. And the guy said, like, I'm waiting for the guy to like yell at me or whatever, and he said, we're out of Schlitz. And I thought, that is like the worst thing he could possibly say. Like, if he would have sworn, I would have felt so much better. So he says that. I've stalled the engine, and it felt like when you're in a car and you're on ice and you're kind of in a skid, there's almost kind of that natural inclination to kind of like turn into the way you're skidding. And so I'm on the left side, and we are like this, and then the plane starts to go this way, and it just sort of felt like this natural kind of thing to kind of correct. I'm sure the plane was doing it and he was doing it and stuff, but it didn't feel as terrifying as as probably it should have. It was still pretty darn scary. And the next thing I'm thinking of, you were talking about checklists, I'm thinking, okay, how do we pop the canopy? How do I get out of this and pull my chute? I hope the plane doesn't fall on someone in Barrington, kind of a thing. And he got the engine started. We get going again, and I'm thinking, okay, I messed up royally. Let's just go land. I'll kiss the tarmac, and I'm done for today. And then he just goes, re-engage. There he is. I'm like, are you kidding me? And it just like you as well. I mean, like just the calmness under pressure, lots of practice and all this, and I was just, a bag full of jelly after that. So that was, and it was sort of like that's it. I did my salute. Thank you very much for not letting me kill either one of us. And it was just, quite the experience. I mean, that's why I'm been so curious about, how your history and your trajectory through, doing that enough, carriers and everything. I just tip my hat, man. I think that's just amazing.
Yeah, that's a great story. If you didn't get sick, you're doing pretty well. In my last squadron, it was a test squadron, so we had 2-seat versions of our airplane, and I was able to give up some backseat rides to people that were non-pilots. I'm not sure how you get those. some of them would be career military, and as a kind of a good deal before they got out, they get a ride, or
nice.
senator or something like that. And I probably gave 10 of those rides, and if I gave 10 of them, 8 of them of the people threw up within 5 minutes of the airflow, which always made me feel so bad.
They're all excited.
And we get one of them. We got airborne and started turning, and he threw up. And this is going to be a long flight.
Yeah, it kind of takes the fun out of it. So, oh man. Well, again, I'm just it's amazing. We could spend hours of 5 episodes on this. So I want to shift gears, but before I do, I have one last thing to ask. What does Sir James Martin and Captain Valentine Baker mean to you, Rich?
Right. So the airplane I flew has an ejection seat, and if there's a problem with the airplane, then you pull the handle and eject out of it. And so I had to do that in one of the airplanes I was flying, and the seat's made by a company called Martin Baker, which is a British company named after the 2 fellows that you just mentioned. And the ejection seat's a pretty amazing piece of gear. Costs millions of dollars, and you can be in any environment and pull the handle and have a decent chance of living.
Wow.
But it's a Brit company, and so since they're British, they have a sense of humor. And if you eject from one of their seats and live, then you become a lifetime member of the Martin Baker Ejection Tie Club, and they send you this 50s tie. So I rarely wear ties. It's one of the reasons I'm an entrepreneur, but when I do, I generally wear that tie.
That's very cool. That is very cool. We'll have to get that into the show notes and stuff too. What does it look like? Is it like a traditional British striped tie, or is it?
Looks like something you'd wear in the 1950s. It's blue with red, little red, diamonds on it. That are symbols.
But it's kind of cool. I mean, talk about the signaling. You see one of those in somebody else, there's a story.
It's a pretty exclusive club.
Yeah.
That's hard. That's hard criteria to get into it. And nobody volunteers to get into that club.
That's amazing. So shifting gears. Next phase of your career, was it working at Dunrath Capital, or was it grad school?
Grad school. So I went right from. I tell people I've never had a real job. I finished college, and then I was down in Florida that weekend doing physicals stuff for the military, and then I finished the military, went right into grad school.
And why USC?
Well, I'm from the Midwest, so UFC's got a really strong brand in the Midwest.
Yeah.
And my uncle went there, and so I kind of it was the school I wanted to go to. When I got into the Navy, I had the plan that I was going to do my time, and then I was going to go to UFC. So
right, gotcha.
That was sort of my plan from the get-go.
Wow, perfect. So, your time from being in the Navy or being a fighter pilot. Were there things that you could take from that brought you into entrepreneurship?
Yeah, it's actually the military's pretty good training, I think, for that for a few reasons in general. The first one is it really teaches you how to kind of get things done. So that, you deal with a lot of ambiguous things in the military, and it's very outcomes oriented. There's a story in the Navy called Message to Garcia that's about some lieutenant in the late 1800s that had to get a message to some Cuban general named Garcia. And I don't remember the details of the story. I'm not even sure if it's a true story. It's probably Google it, but
we'll look it up for the show notes.
We'll look it up for the show notes. But the moral of the story is, that the story is this guy has to go through the jungle for 5 days and do all kinds of crazy things to find this general, but he, the message needs to get through, and so he has to go figure it out. And the president's giving him the message, and so doesn't want to know the details. He just wants the message through, and they kind of frame things that way in the military too. They're very outcome oriented and just go figure it out, and then whatever ambiguity you have to figure that out, get to an outcome. And that seems to serve you pretty well in anything entrepreneurial. There's it's when you're doing new things, there's always ambiguity, things always change, and you need to adapt and just get to an outcome.
So when right out of grad school, though, you worked in private equity and venture capital.
I went to school, and then I did that as an internship.
Oh, I see. Okay, gotcha. So was it always kind of in the trajectory rather than like being a consultant or working for a VC or whatever to really have your own shop and start your own business?
Yeah, I pretty early, so that when it's a 2-year program, the one that I went through, and you kind of spend the first half of it kind of thinking about what you want to do and deciding what you really want to do. And the kind of startup entrepreneur track is kind of interesting to a lot of people, but it's pretty risky and hard. And so, I think in my class there was 250 people. If you polled everyone when they started, and said, "Are you interested in entrepreneurship?" Probably a third of them would have said yes. But by the end of that program, not many people actually do that.
Because they see what it really takes, or
it's risky.
Yeah.
It's hard, and you take on a lot of risk, and you don't start. If you get out and you go into one of the traditional tracks, consulting or banking or whatever, then you're kind of starting down that track and putting your time. If you do something that's not standard, then and you need to go back to one of those tracks, it's harder to do that if you do that. And it pays less, and it's harder. It's probably harder work.
Well, yeah, and I think too, your point is, risk. It's one thing to step into an associate position at a place that's been in business for 60, 70 years, as opposed to starting your own place and all the moving parts that requires too. So, so from the entrepreneurial spark, was it always going to be something in healthcare? Was it always going to be something in the behavioral healthcare space? Or tell us the origin story of Prevail Health.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of decided, before the end of my second year that I wanted to do something entrepreneurial. So I was pretty, all in to go figure that out. And in my second year, I had a class on social entrepreneurship, and part of the class was to come up with a social entrepreneurship idea. And I came up with Prevail out of the class.
In school?
Yep.
Wow. And so you build out a business plan, or what was the class like?
Yeah, you start out, you build out a business plan, an idea, and then you present it to the class. And so I did that. And, there's a bunch of people in classes presenting business plans that they're never going to go and do anything with. But, I sort of didn't take that path. And I said, hey, I think this is a good idea that I could get behind. I want to do something entrepreneurial. I want to do something that's, for a good cause and does something positive in the world. And, this is a great area. And so I guess thought harder than other people. How can I really make a go of this and make it real?
So it was really, in a sense, from my perspective, so correct me if I misperceive, but it's really sort of like a synthesis or a blending then of the military with the focus on DOD and VA, that kind of a thing. So it brought in, you had the expertise and experience of knowing what military life is like, but then also bringing in a business perspective to it, and having then the product, so to speak, to be something to address the as everyone sees in the media today, the growing mental health needs of a variety of different kinds of populations. But you started off really with veteran populations, and that's still somewhat the sweet spot, but it's also expanded out beyond that too, right?
Right. Yeah. Our kind of my plan from the beginning was a two-step plan. Step one, build and validate this program in the veteran space. There's lots of returning service members with issues. There's big need, and so there's a lot of attention and resources. And so use that attention and resources to build out and validate a program in a rigorous way in that space. And then if we can do that, move to step two and take that to the broader, commercial marketplace where there's, 65 million adults with mood disorders. It's one of the top health cost drivers, was the plan from the get-go.
Mm-hmm. So what was, you had your business plan, you had it maybe, sort of acid tested in graduate school at a prestigious business school. So what was day one like? How did you literally start? Did you, bootstrap? Did you have funding? Tell us that granularity of how did it literally start?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's because there's really not a lot of answers. You don't find a lot of books on that stage of startup. That's kind of like the messy gray area where there's no, you just got to figure it out on your own. And it's really hard at the beginning there to go from an idea and a concept to something real. And it's a bit of a, parlor game, if you will, or you just, for a while, you're kind of running an idea out of the trunk of your car saying, I have a business, come follow me, and trying to convince people that that's a true statement.
Did you start with a board? Did you have funding?
No, I started with an idea, and then I, went and pitched around to see if I could get some support behind that. I was fortunate to have some good connections via, internship that I did in school and other connections to my network. And so tried to get, some smart people smarter than me to get their opinion and weigh in on that. But at some point, I had to go and put some risk into it myself by putting some, early money into it at risk myself. I also had to kind of jump into it full time. So before I finished school, I jumped into working full time on Prevail and said, hey, I'm going to go put an amount of resources in, create a runway for a certain amount of time, and just make this a full time job. And brought in a few other people for different roles, and spent that time trying to figure out how to get more resources. Early on, when you have an idea, the next thing you need is resources to go try and build out some version of that idea and bring it into the world. And so, I took the risk to supply some of the early resources and took the risk to go do that as a full-time job that really wasn't paid, and get it to a certain point to raise resources to then kind of take that to the next level. And so how I did that next thing was, I looked around at what's the different funding sources, and one of them is our grants. And so I applied to a grant program through the National Science Foundation called the Small Business Innovation Research Grant Program. And it's kind of like the government's VC model. Theories, take taxpayer dollars, put it into promising new technologies. Hopefully that creates useful things and jobs. And I applied into that grant program. I was lucky enough to get awarded into it.
Wow.
And so that supplied me with early funding to build out my technology. That also gave me an impromptu to then do other things like raise some investment money on that from, kind of early friends and family sort of investment, as well as then, get in an area where I could start to get funding from other grant sources.
It's sort of, my experience with those is knowing too that it's also quite the street cred too, right? The fact that they don't hand those out to every business that comes to them. So that, it's sort of like a nice thing that there's funding, and then there's also the prestige aspect of it as well. Is there what I don't know about SBIRs and STTRs and that sort of thing is, you said that it's like, VC funding from a governmental side. Does then, when things take off, do they get their share? Do they cash out, or is there a economic incentive for them too?
So the as part of the program, and so it's different for each agency. So each of the 12 federal funding agencies are supposed to take part in the SBIR program up to a certain amount, and they run that program unique to each agency. So each agency can run it differently. Huh. But in general, there's limited rights that go to the government to, and I'm going to butcher the legal definition of this, but the government essentially has rights to field the technology if you don't field it. So they're kind of more looking to, if they invest in new things that are, have a bunch of benefit to society, that investment pays off and those things are created. And for some reason, the company can't commercialize that. They don't want that to sit on the shelves. And so they want to have the right for the government to commercialize that. I don't know that they've ever exercised that right in practice because and the program's it's actually a great government program. It really made Prevail and helped us build out what's now a pretty unique technology. And, the kind of as a backbone for that program, or at least the NSF's version of that program, is the recognition that the government's not private industry and they want to do, what the government does well and not do what the government doesn't do well. And so they're not looking to commercialize things that come out of that program itself. They're looking to put in the funding risk to take things that are conceptual and could have a bunch of benefit, but it's risky to go build those out. They want to bridge that risk. And then if that risk is proven successful, then they want to help commercialize it. And so it's actually a multi-phase grant. They give you a little bit of money in the first phase to build out a proof of concept and convince them that it has potential and is viable. If you can convince them of that, then there's follow-on funding phases to help you build that to a commercial product and take that through early commercialization. It's
great. Stages. It's such a win-win because those are all super reasonable things and expectations. Hey, we're going to give you money. We need to, and you're like going, yeah, we want to really kind of test it too, and fail early or whatever. Find out if this isn't going to be something that's going to be sustainable or that we can grow in the way that we want. And correct me if I'm wrong. I know historically this was the case. I don't know if it still is, but do they have different deadlines throughout the course of a year? Like, I grew up in an academic situation in which, the NIH might fund this one specific grant one time. here's the one deadline for it, and if you're a day late, then you're not going to be getting that grant. But SBIRs are different. Is that still the case?
It might be different now too. I think it changes fairly frequently, but it was on a schedule, so there was a deadline for submissions for that year, and we had to get it in by the deadline for that submission for the first phase. Once you get funded the first phase, the timeline is unique to the company. So whenever you finish what you were supposed to do in the first phase, you can then apply for follow-on funding phases. Yeah. And we were fortunate to get through so we got 2 additional funding phases after the first one.
That's great. That's the grand slam, right? I mean, there's 3 total that you could possibly do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So it's if you look on the NSF's website, we're one of their success stories, and it's turned out great for both of us. But yeah, it was a phenomenal program.
For sure, have that in the show notes. So what was the hardest thing back in those days? And it's been, what's the tenure? 9-ish years? 9, 10 years?
Yeah, it's about 8.5 years.
8.5 years. Okay. So if you can go back and channel that time, what was the biggest pains in getting things started and hardest to do?
Yeah, at the early stage, it's kind of what we talked about. It's very risky, and the chances of success at that stage are a lot lower than you recognize. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it at the time.
Yeah.
And and there's no rule book. You're kind of just hook or crook, doing whatever you can to convince people to open doors for you, give you resources so you can have a chance of getting that off the ground. And so that's really challenging to do. And that's definitely the hardest part of that stage.
What continues to be the hardest today?
Today, the hardest part's definitely people. So, finding and hiring really good people, empowering them to do a good job, motivating them, keeping them interested to stay on. It's very challenging.
I think that's kind of the case for a lot of, tech companies, tech startups, what have you. And it's sort of interesting, like the Chicago area, it just seems like there's just a high demand for those kinds of things that, I've heard, like the Silicon Prairie kind of thing, that you think about, will Amazon come here? I just read in Cranes in the last couple of days or last week that Google is, going to have a bigger presence here. I don't know exactly what that means, but it probably means hiring. So, it does create a variety of different kinds of challenges. I think, especially if you're very much tech oriented and tech dependent, and getting the right kind of talent and being able to keep them as well. So, was there anything then and now that was easy?
So I don't really look at it on the level of easy or hard.
Yeah.
Because it's all hard work, but I look at it more on the axis. I look at it on is it something that I or we can control the outcome or not? So things that we at Prevail can control, whether we get to a successful outcome if we just work harder. I view those as easy because they're achievable. Mm-hmm. Whereas things that it depends on other people outside of Prevail, and we have to convince someone to do something, or we got to convince users to do things. We don't control the whole outcome there. We could work as hard as we want, and we might not get to that outcome. Mm-hmm. And so I really separate the world between those things now. And some of those first ones, they're not easy. They take a lot of hard work, but that hard work is going to equal a result. Yeah. Which makes that work not as hard.
Bad. Yeah, I get that. That makes perfect sense. So, Prevail is really kind of in a unique space. Can you talk about what, like, the initial maybe, and what evolved audiences are in terms of like how Prevail is different, or what distinguishes you amongst other kinds of, healthcare, behavioral healthcare companies?
Yeah. So and I assume people get this in the program notes, but it's an online behavioral health program. And there's a few things that separate us that we, intended early on. The first one is we want to I set out to do this in a way that we would build a rigorous evidence base behind it. So there's lots of health tech out there. There's lots of behavioral health tech out there. And part of the problem now is sort of separating the, wheat from the chaff, if you will. And so we recognize early on that it's going to be really important to build our programs in a very rigorous way, validate them in a very rigorous way. And so, it took us 5 years to build out and validate our initial programs. In that time, we did pilots with tens of thousands of people with the VA, and we did real clinical trials we're, IRB approved clinical trials published in top tier journals. And that's a lot harder than not doing that. And we purposely did that so that we could go establish the evidence base of our programs and that they're valid, in the hopes that that would be a differentiator in the marketplace. And we, believe that they really are these days. Another area that we were kind of different is we chose to really focus on the users and what the users want, which sounds funny to say, but in the health space, it's really not. You have to make a choice because the ultimate consumers of healthcare, you and I and the rest of us, are often not the payers. The insurance companies or big companies pay for our healthcare, we consume it. And so when you're starting a business in health tech, you really need to decide who you're going to target. Am I target the people paying the bills, or am I targeting the users? And, you might hear that and say, well, of course you want to target the users and make the best program, but it's pretty hard in a business to not target the people paying the bills. And so, I think you find a lot of people picking that one, and we made a very conscious effort to pick the first one and let's target users, let's build a program that's usable and that people will do. And eventually we'll capture, eventually we'll make something that's valuable, and that if to the extent that that's valuable, it'll capture value. And, that's a different way to go. And we picked doing that early on.
I think that, just to really emphasize, one of the things that I was always impressed with, learning about Prevail was the randomized controlled trials. And such a distinguishing feature. I did a LinkedIn influencer blog a while back. One of their things is they want you to get your crystal ball out and make predictions and stuff. And 2 or 3 years ago, I had researched the number of apps, and I was predicting incorrectly that Darwinian market forces would cause, I forget what the number was, it's something 165 healthcare apps were out there whenever I was writing this. And then I did a follow-up 2 years later, and the number was 348,000 or something. And it hadn't dwindled, whatsoever. But some of the changes were there was a shift away from lifestyle apps and a shift towards more healthcare specific related apps. And I think also in the sense of some were more disease management, so to speak, like diabetes and things like that are very trackable, especially if you've got, sensors and Fitbits and scales and food and calories and stuff like that. But I think one of the things, if my crystal ball is any better, I think that it is that sort of the thing that you guys, found a long time ago, was to focus on really having a strong empirical basis, and to be able to, whoever it is that's going to be a collaborator or a customer or a payer, are going to look at, how do we know that what you do is any different? How do we know that what you do is effective? And you can go back to, like you said, top tier peer-reviewed journals to be able to say, well, here's the acid test that we did for this. Here's what this was looked at by, blinded third-party reviewers. And that, I think, distinguishes, a lot of what Prevail can offer than, the hundreds or thousands of whatever other apps that are out there that are just sort of, cutesy, kinds of things. So, and good clinical ones too. But, yours is also, I think, predicated on a very solid cognitive behavioral health care or cognitive behavioral therapy model too, right? So
right.
People can go through that, and then also being able to have peer support. So it's not just sort of a plug and play kind of thing. So can you talk a little bit more about that, of maybe the transition from solely veteran focused to other kinds of populations, who are good users, who are good candidates for Prevail Health?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we started out in the veteran space, and the first thing to say about behavioral health is, it's kind of a broad topic. So it's, depression is not as dissimilar to, a heart attack. When someone has a heart attack, that's a kind of a black and white event with a standard course after that. Some depression, if you kind of hold it up to that lens, it's different. We don't exactly know what depression is. It's different for different people. People go in and out of depression, and most behavioral health issues are sort of like that. The second thing that's complicated about it is that many people with these issues either don't know they have these issues or don't want to do anything about them. They're what we call reluctant care seekers. Mm-hmm. And nowhere is that really more so the case than in the veteran space. If many veterans, they're not lining up to do online mental health programs.
Right.
And so faced with that hard reality, we had to go out and take a very pragmatic look at programs like this and how do we engage people that might not otherwise engage and get them into programs. And there really is no easy answer, and there's no silver bullet answer. There's no one thing. It's a combination of a bunch of things. It's also a function of casting a very wide net so that you can have lots of touch points, touch people in various areas, where it's at and convenient for them, or they might do things, and then stick with them and stay with them over time. And so it's a really big problem to solve, and changing behaviors is complicated, and it's also hard work. It seems like the marketplace always wishes that there's some easy answer. There's some passive,
Right.
make a game and that everyone loves to do, and that also solves other problems.
Yeah.
And, it's not really like that. And I think one area that most of us can relate to is just weight maintenance and management. It's, if we're out of shape, it's not a mystery what we need to do to get in shape.
Right.
It's just a lot of hard work and things we don't want to do. And so getting us to do those hard things and change our behaviors is hard work and challenging to do. And so that's a long-winded way of saying that, I think the military veteran space was an interesting place to start because they're the most reluctant, hardest ones to engage. And so we kind of said, hey, if we can engage veterans and get them to do a program like this, then we can go and engage anyone and get them to do programs like this. And so, with that, we've been for about the last 4 years moving to step 2 of our 2-step plan there. And, for veterans, we have a veterans program at Vets Prevail. We have civilian versions at iPrevail, and then we have a number of other condition-specific versions of the program. Right now, we're working with a couple payers and in talks with CMS to bring this to Medicare and Medicaid populations. And so we've really branched out from that initial foundation in the veteran space to a number of different programs in the non-veteran space.
And PTSD, anxiety, depression, what kinds of things?
Yeah, the programs are based on cognitive behavioral therapy and problem-solving techniques. So essentially all the conditions that you can apply CBT towards. So
pretty broad spectrum then. So,
pretty broad spectrum. And we have both population-specific programs. So we have a program for veterans. It's, very skinned up. It's very relevant to veterans and their unique issues. Within that, you can do different programs for conditions. We have a generalized program at iPrevail that's for generalized versions. We have, a postpartum depression version of the program. So we have, both different versions of the platform for different demographics and populations, as well as a bunch of different programs within each of those for conditions that people might have.
Gotcha. So you started off Prevail, the seed of it was in business school. What were the things that you found most helpful from your training at UFC at Prevail, and maybe what was least helpful?
I thought I had a great time in business school, and I've learned a lot. So, which is kind of, business school kind of gets a bit of a bad rap for grad schools with respect to the other, if you go to the people getting a graduate degree in economics, they kind of say that everyone at business school is out golfing all day long, and it's not really true. It's, at least I thought it was hard.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot, but you learn a lot about strategy there and just how to critically think about, what's a good business idea, what's not, what's a good path, what's a good path to market. How would you do that? How would you sustain that? Mm-hmm. They have a very rigorous process to kind of, teach you how to think about things like that in a really rigorous way. It's also great connections. There's a lot of alumni that went there and you can connect with. And so I've had a lot of help from people that are alumni from Booth that have, become advisors of mine or things like that. And so that's also really, really helpful.
What, you talked about like the part 1 or phase 1 and phase 2. What are your thoughts about scaling? Like, how do you then start to do these other kinds of things, getting in? It sounds like maybe being more payer focused, or do you build out more things on the platform, or kind of what's next, and what's what's next for Prevail Health, but then how does an entrepreneur go about scaling to whatever those what nexts are?
Yeah, I think the first thing you have to decide is, do you want to bootstrap something into the world, or are you looking to build something to a point where you can then, bring in investment resources and scale it that way? And those are two different problems to solve. Prevail is definitely the first. So, in addition to the evidence base and a user-centered focus, we also set out to think about cost and try to figure out how we could bring a model like this at a low cost. And so in order to do that, we, mostly bootstrapped this into existence. And we kind of have that mentality. And so, at least where we're at now, we're focused on just growing ourselves organically, customer at a time, and growing the platform, which is a different way to scale the program than if you want to bring in resources and try and scale quickly like that. It's health tech, and especially behavioral health is an interesting space because it's very big. So there's lots of people with these issues. It drives tremendous costs, and it's really sort of early days in behavioral health. And so it's a big market it's a large market that can have a lot of companies in there. And so, I think in most, early stage things, pre-market, entrepreneurial type things, you have to think more about timeline and how do I move quickly and get a first mover advantage or the competition. Whereas in the health space, it's not to say that that's not important, but it seems a little less, you can take your time a little more and do things right. And things take time in the health space because you have to build out an evidence base and you have to go get people to do it for real in the real world. It's, there's a bunch of foundational things you have to do to have a viable product in the space that takes some time. Right.
And those aren't necessarily the technology parts. I had Ed Marks, who's the CIO of Cleveland Clinic, on the show a couple of episodes back, and he was talking about his experiences of kind of what got him into the health and medical areas, and a lot of the stuff that he had seen, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, aren't necessarily a whole lot different today. I mean, there's still a reliance on faxes and beepers, that kind of technology. It's probably less hackable, I guess, but it's interesting. You can't rush, a randomized, controlled trial. You can't, no matter how much technology you have, it's not necessarily it might help with little bits and pieces of analysis or, whatever with a program or something. But I think that those are very different, distinguishable kinds of things. And I think, speaking as a psychologist myself, the stuff I see coming from like the American Psychological Association, people are still, and I think still is the right word, still struggling with trying to figure out, how health tech works in specific to psychology, but I think in anything in behavioral health care, what's okay, what's not okay, randomized controlled trials, where does the lines blur between, practicing in a different state and telehealth and, all these things I think are currently things that are very much in play, and as well with providers, but also with payers, as you've talked about, with reaching out to third-party payers as well as Medicare, Medicaid, VA kinds of things. So it is a complex, disconnected kind of thing. My hopes are that the technology and companies like Prevail can kind of bring those things together fundamentally to be able to impact the patient. But it is a complex, kind of scenario. So I want to be cognizant of your time and just have a few last questions I'd like to wrap up with. How do you manage being a founding CEO and also a dad and managing a family?
Right. Well, it's not easy. That's the first thing I'll say. And you might get a different answer if you ask my wife on my effectiveness of that job. But, I think you just have to make time for your family and your kids. So, you're always busy. There's always a fire drill going on. There's a million things to do and emails to catch. And so I just, when it's my family's time, I make it their time and I just don't do anything else. And I do that religiously. And I just try not to ever encroach on that is really the best advice I can give there.
That's good. How old are your kids?
One's 6 and one's 4.
Okay. So they're probably not so understanding what dad's job is kind of a thing yet, right? Or are they?
No, yeah, they don't. They have no idea what I do.
All right, gotcha. So this is 4 possible answers, multiple choice. What's more stressful, flying F-18s, running a successful company, or being a dad?
They're different kinds of stress, right? The flying an F-18 is exhilarating. It's dangerous. There's a lot going on, and so it's kind of, more of a salient stress. But being a dad is you you care about your kids a lot and you really want the right outcome. And so you're very vested in the choices you make there, and you're very worried about making bad ones. And that kind of, wears on you. And so it's kind of a University of Chicago answer where, everything's equivalently hard. It's sort of the answer I give. People ask me, so Prevail's been interesting because we have raised, grant funding from both government foundations. We've raised investment funding, and then, we've sold a bunch of customers, both commercial and in the government space. So I've sort of raised resources from every source that you can. And so I get people that ask me all the time, advice on how, they're starting out and they say, should I try and raise money from here or there? Which one's harder or easier? And my answer to them is none of them. They're all equivalently hard for different reasons, which is a bit of a University of Chicago free markets answer. But similarly, they're all very stressful in different ways. Starting a business is also really challenging. It's a lot of stress, and the buck stops with you. And so, at the end of the day, there's a lot of things that you have to do because no one else is going to do those. And always being that person all the time is it takes a certain type of person to be able and willing to do that. And I think you can't be an entrepreneur unless you do that. And so if someone was asking me, hey, should I be an entrepreneur? I'd ask them two questions. One is, what's your risk tolerance? Because, I'm an entrepreneur for the same reason I flew airplanes off of aircraft carriers. I have high risk tolerance. And not everyone does, which isn't a bad thing. It's probably not normal or sane.
Yeah, it's probably a very good thing.
Yeah. And then, the second one is being in charge is hard. Having the buck stop with you is difficult. It's nice to look to someone else and say, well, it's 6 o'clock. I'm tired. My kids are waiting for me. Someone else can deal with that. And when you're the boss, you can't do that. And so you really need to be okay with that. And it's very stressful to be that person.
So it sounds like being with your time is an opportunity to re-energize and relax. Are there other things in particular that help you blow off steam, or that get you ready for a new week?
Yeah, my kids are 6 and 4, so that's a busy time for kids. And so now my bucket's full with just trying to tread water there with what they need in business. But I read a lot of books also, and try and not think about work all the time and decompress with other things.
Well, that's one of my questions. Like, are there do you read books on business? Or do you read fiction? I mean, what do you like to read? Who do you like to read?
Yeah, I'm probably the appropriate answer is I read a bunch of management books. But I read a bunch of biographies, really. Right now I'm pretty interested in the the Revolutionary War and the Civil War kind of time periods. And so I read books on people during those periods and find that interesting. For some reason, I don't find fiction books interesting right now. I needs to be some real story about the past.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I've seen just sort of headline things like in Fast Company blurbs and stuff about there seems to be more of a looking towards biographies and things like that for people to apply in the business setting, kind of thing. Like, the really what's in vogue now, Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius and stuff like that he didn't write it to be a book or something, but just sort of like his journal of like, here's another day of having to, go to war or go to battle or being responsible for all this stuff, and no one's grateful, just everything's wrong, and just kind of learning how to have the, the grit or the fortitude or the whatever to be able to do that and to say, yeah, this is kind of how it works, So I think there's a lot that entrepreneurs could probably take from, looking at biographies in challenging times.
Yeah, I think one thing I learned the more that life goes on, and, maybe maybe this is a secret everyone learns at the end, but things just don't change. There's people have been having the same problems for a long time. And so reading about the past and what people did, I think tells you, a lot. But yeah, it's also I read recently a book on George Washington, and it's about the American Revolution. And anytime, I'm complaining or my team's complaining, I think of that book and the trials that he had to go through to keep a band of 8,000 people, half of them clothed through most of the winters, together, and some of the hardships that they went through is pretty amazing. So, yeah.
Yeah, it really kind of re-gauges your appreciation for things and expectations and whatnot. So I feel like I do that a lot. My kids are much older than yours, but sort of it's become a cliche in our household lately about first world problems, like the Wi-Fi is not fast enough or, what have you. It's like, yeah, that's what I complained about when I was 20 or what have you. So,
Right.
I want to wrap up with just a couple last questions. What advice would you have for listeners who want to support veterans but are unsure how to go about doing that?
Sure. If that's a question about donating, then, part of the problem in the veteran space is there's a lot of noise. So there's a lot of veteran service organizations. I think there's 40,000 of them out there now.
Really?
Yep. And so kind of figuring out which ones are good, you want to pick is difficult and challenging with all that noise. And, I think the best thing you can do there is look to signals. Signals are people that you know and trust and who they advise. So, look to people that you know, and do they have connections with any service organizations? That, or, choose larger ones that you can look back at their history and look at what percentage of their resources do they actually give to veterans. For every $100 they take in, how many of those actually go out to services that help veterans, is the best weather vane. There's a lot of veterans. There's a broad area of needs. And so there's lots of different VSOs and places that you can go and help. And so it's tough for me to say, hey, go here. But, going and doing your research is required in that space because, a bunch of them are doing really great work. There's also some that are, doing less good work. And so you really want to kind of go and figure that out.
Gotcha. Good. We'll get those in the show notes. There's also, I'm familiar with a organization. It's called GuideStar, and they're sort of a vetting, entity, so to speak. So you can go in and put specific search parameters of kind of, what you want to support. And then they give like a star ranking, or I think there's just like a, platinum, silver, gold, bronze, or something like that. So depending upon how transparent the organization is, how much money goes to, the end, individual kind of thing or organization is another way. So we'll put that in the show notes. You mentioned throughout the course of our conversation, which I have just totally enjoyed, Rich, thank you, about Prevail and I Prevail and the different flavors and varieties of that. I know that your Prevail is on Twitter. I know Prevail has its website. I know Prevail has a Facebook presence. What are the best ways for our listeners? We'll get all these detailed in the show notes, but what are the various socials and places that people can follow up with Prevail, and or if they want to reach out to you, or if they're interested in looking to be a part of Prevail, what's the best ways to go about doing that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So, as you said, you can go to our Facebook page, our Twitter account. If you're a user, the best place to go is just iprevail.com. So the letter I and then prevail.com. If you want to know more about Prevail in the business, then you can go to Prevail Health. So one word, prevailhealth.com. And if you want to get an email to me, just send it to team@prevailhealth.com and say this email's for Rich, and it'll get through to me.
Awesome. Good. We'll get all that detailed in the show notes. So again, Rich, just congratulations on the continuing success and what you've been able to do with Prevail Health. And I appreciate the opportunity also to kind of get a little bit deeper dive in your background and origin story. It's been a great show. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Living a Life in Full is a production of Stout Media, a subsidiary of Gordian Knott, LLC. Assistant producer, Gracie Wong. Music, Dan O'Brien. Post-production, Sam Rude. Graphics, Larry Newberry. Executive producer and host, Dr. Chris Stout. To learn more, stop by our website, alifeinfull.org, for show notes. And please recommend us to your friends and leave us a review on iTunes. Thanks.